Um, Now, I just posted a little thing on Instagram to the Conspirituality pod feed, and it was about this, and it was really also further stimulated by the interview that I did with Sean Corn that dropped this week, in which, right near the end of it, she was talking about the fear that is so palpable in conspirituality and QAnon discourse, and how, if you peel that back, maybe what you would find is grief. And, you know, before she said that, I'd already been working on this little story or reflection on the emotional poverty of the manipulative QAnon and conspirituality discourses. So yeah, and this reflection really came out of the ability to disconnect for a week, a couple of weeks back now, as my family and I were able to go to Manitoulin Island and unplug. And it gave the unplugging reduced two things: speed, obviously, like there was no longer a fire hose at my mouth, but also it 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 brought down, it re-regulated affect, and that was really nice. Okay, so we're up at this same cabin that my partner's parents have rented for almost 30 years. It's pokey and rustic, but like 200 yards through this evergreen forest to this, there's the sand dunes, and then there's Lake Huron. It's not expensive. It's not chic. It's not gentrified. I shouldn't actually be telling you where it is. Uh, there are cell towers now up there, but somehow even the phone seems slow and kind of boring. So several times I had this fantasy of just you know putting its sleek, flat design to real use and skipping it like a stone out over the glassy lake. Um, Okay, so we're talking one evening, and the adults are talking, and Leonard Cohen's name comes up. Now, if you don't know who Leonard Cohen is, he's like a patron saint of modern Canadian literature, iconic songwriter. He died a few years ago. I was able to go with my brother to see him, I think, in the last concert that he played in Toronto, so that was a real gift. And in white person Canada, at least, it's cool to love Cohen and know all of his books and songs. And it's even cooler to both love him and hate him a little bit, to love his insight and then to also hate him for, making this kind of romantic misogyny sound, really appealing or even Jungian for several decades. Anyway, complicated guy. So the 7-year-old in our family overhears the name and says, "So who is Leonard Cohen anyway?" And so I gave him the short version, that he was a writer and songwriter who many people loved. And I reminded the 7-year-old that we used to play a lot of Leonard Cohen in the house when he was a baby, especially when we were trying to put him to sleep. And if you've heard Leonard Cohen croon, you know what I'm talking about. Um, and I offered to sing him a song to see if he remembered, and he said yes. So I sang him a little bit of Suzanne. And the song just like hit me, as it always has. It's strange, it's elliptical, it's shimmering, especially the second verse that says, "And Jesus was a sailor as he walked upon the waters, and he spent a long time watching from his lonely wooden tower. And when he knew for certain only drowning men could see him, he said, 'All men shall be sailors then, until the sea shall free them.' But he himself was broken long before the sky would open, forsaken, almost human. He sank beneath your wisdom like a stone." Uh, so the 7-year-old cocked his head and kind of stared into space, and then he said, "Huh." And I said, "I know, right? Like, what does that all mean?" And I will never quite answer that question because the song is like a dream. And, Cohen turns the crucifix in the desert into a lonely tower by an ocean. His mission was unfulfilled. And yet this all the same, this hopeless story, he still was able to sink beneath your wisdom, but like a stone, like something inert. And I guess it really struck me as we head into this harrowing fall that what is most absent from all of the data that we look at on this podcast and all of the influencers who blast it out is a spectrum of emotions that unfolds slowly enough to be digestible. So in previous episodes, I've picked apart the emotional manipulation tactics of, the conspirituality influencers, and the typical pattern is to whipsaw back and forth between terror and transcendence. So the influencer scares the shit out of you, and then they offer you some kind of wisdom product, and they maintain intrusive eye contact throughout, and their eyes their eyes are like fire and brimstone, but then they might be drippy and tearful, and there's nothing in the middle. And to me, the middle is where Leonard Cohen stood, in a swirl of fraught ambivalence. And so what I'm not hearing from Ricky Willis, Zach Bush, Sayer G, Kelly Brogan, or any of these people is that middle range of emotional reality where things are just strange and unresolved. But they're not just strange and unresolved. They move slowly enough. And if you have patience and a kind of contemplative humility, you can also manage them. So I've got a list of what I'm not hearing. And on the list, grief, as Sean Korn points out, melancholy, irony. I'm not talking about sarcasm, which is something different. Sarcasm, just is the basic building block of 4chan, 8chan, and 8kun, where Q actually emerges from. I'm not talking about sarcasm. I also don't hear in these posts, in this content, any ennui, any boredom. I don't hear bitterness. I don't hear resignation. I don't hear reluctance. I don't hear vulnerability. I don't hear the queasy feeling of being self-conscious. So by and large, the feeling states that these folks are subjecting us to are on extreme ends of the spectrum. So mountain peaks and then really dark forests, catastrophizing, then prophesying. The common denominator is intensity. And so here I want to say something about how some commentators are correlating conspirituality and QAnon behaviors with mental illness. And if you listen to the description I just gave, that makes sense because it scans against popular understandings of like bipolar disorder, for instance. But I think we have to be very careful about this line of thinking because the fact is that we just don't have any data about the internal states or diagnostic histories of the people we're talking about. Now, that said, I can say from 15 years of experience in the wellness industry that the whole scene is heavily populated with people who have migrated to it in search of mental relief. And in some cases, I believe that those who have made it big in a landscape where charisma is the coin of the realm are precisely those who have been able to monetize their own mental dysregulation. There's a lot of people we could name here, people who have been open about their struggles. I'll stick to mentioning a late friend of mine because his case is pretty clear and he's now dead. Michael Stone was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He managed it really well in his public life. And this meant that he could show great capacity for both depressive vulnerability, but also radiant joy. And it's no secret that he migrated towards teaching all of the self-regulatory practices that he found to be most balancing for himself. And I believe that he was really successful because his need for balance was desperate, and this gave his content a messianic quality to it. He taught Zen practices like he was hanging on by his teeth. Now, as I've implied, I think it's important to not draw a causal line between mental health struggles and conspirituality or QAnon adherence, because that's ableist, it's also unscientific. It also ignores all of those who struggle with neuroatypicality but don't drift into that territory, or who actually might be more sensitive analysts of that territory. So, that whole direction can be as misleading and cruel as associating criminal activity with psychiatric conditions. At the same time, I think that we have to understand that wellness emerged to stop the gaps in conventional care, and into those gaps flowed people looking for help. And if they couldn't find it, they had to make it happen themselves. So Michael is by no means alone amongst spiritual celebrities who have had to improvise their own relief. Now, all of this is taking place within what Debord calls the society of the spectacle. Influencers can't prove that they're healthy. They have to perform health. And with social media being what it is, the loudest performances shine through, the highest highs and the lowest lows. So the basic bipolar structure of conspirituality has been baked into the economics and performance of wellness for decades. And the only thing that's really changed is that it has shifted from the consumer into the political domain. A really big part of me is just can't believe that Michael is missing this. He died before Trump was elected, and so part of me is also jealous. But a larger part of me misses watching what he would have made of all of this if he were still alive. I think it could have been very easy for him to feel the escalations of this fall, of this particular time period, as projections, as macrocosms of his own internal conflicts. I could imagine him circling down into the QAnon mythos. But I also believe that he would have held himself back through a hard-won maturity, recognizing the difference between the phantasms of the world and the material conflicts of his own soul. And he was like an Uncle Leonard that way. Cohen himself was apt to blend his personal confusions with the arcs of history. But the difference is that he knew he was an artist, not a politician, and certainly not a wellness influencer. So as an artist, I feel Leonard Cohen knew something very important about what makes for an enriching story. All of the emotions have to be involved. They have to harmonize. If there's a resolution, that resolution should make sense from many different directions. Here's something that both Michael and Leonard shared: an appreciation for the scale of the very small. Perhaps they came at this through their shared fondness for Zen literature, in which a water drop or a single bean or a pine needle becomes an object of endless, tranquil fascination. When conspiritualists, by contrast, focus on the granular, even that has to be cosmic in some way. A probiotic supplement that contains complete power, the exosome that will heal everything, the chaga mushroom that contains the mystery of life, raw chocolate that vibrates on the frequency of the sun. And one thing that I loved about Michael was that he had the capacity to be fulfilled by a good cup of coffee. There's one conspiritualist I study who even turns coffee into a bipolar fetish object. Kelly Brogan says you must, while you're on her programs, you must absolutely never drink it. You're not going to use it, but if you squirt it up your ass in enema form, it will heal you. It will contribute to your regulation. So that song by Leonard Cohen is about a woman named Suzanne. And, the critics and the historians have figured out who Suzanne was, and there's a whole story there. But on the level of the song, she's an eccentric who teaches the singer something about melancholy, wonder, resilience, and the scale of the really small. So the third verse goes, maybe I'll actually sing it. Suzanne takes you down to her place near the river. She is wearing rags and feathers from Salvation Army counters, and the sun pours down like honey on Our Lady of the Harbor. And she shows you where to look among the garbage and the flowers. There are heroes in the seaweed. There are children in the morning. They are leaning out for love, and they will lean that way forever while Suzanne holds the mirror. So there's nothing junk food. There's nothing peaks and valleys about this. So in closing, I'll just say that the world is still filled with songs that give us the long view of the very small, the epiphanies of meh, and there's a spirituality that's mature, and it's filled with hard-won emotions. It's a spirituality that I can contemplate with my son without telling him how to feel, and that will just let me enjoy watching him discover something that can't quite be named. All right, talk to you soon.